Welcome to Electrically Canadian, Episode 5. My name is Ken Pierce, and this edition is a follow-up from our previous episode, this time covering our return trip from Delta, BC near Vancouver to our home in Calgary in August of 2022. We had a great time in the Vancouver area while there, and were able to keep the car charged well using free or low-cost Level 2 chargers around the city. While we were there, we were able to visit my parents and sister, who all live in the area, do some shopping, visit the beach, drive through downtown Vancouver, visit Stanley Park, and even stop in at the Sunflower Festival in Richmond. As is always the case, though, it was eventually time to go home. As I covered in Episode 4, our trip to the coast went pretty smoothly, with our only real challenge being some broken chargers in Salmon Arm, BC. Because we knew those chargers weren't working well, we planned our return trip using a better route planner to deliberately avoid them. We also had a better idea of what the car was capable of range-wise in the weather conditions we were dealing with, so we're willing to push it a little further between charges. We left my sister's home in Delta, BC at 8:15 a.m. Pacific Daylight Time, and after picking up a few essentials for the road, sometimes referred to as donuts, we were on our way. The car had about 70% charge when we left, so we planned our first charging stop for a Petro-Canada fast charger in Abbotsford, BC, about 62 kilometers away. Traffic was pretty heavy, so it took us about an hour to get to the charger in Abbotsford in a very busy shopping plaza. After navigating our way around the drive-through lineups for McDonald's and Starbucks and a pickup truck that decided one of the EV charging stations was just another parking spot, we were able to plug in. The car hit 80% charge about 15 minutes later, just long enough for us to walk over to Starbucks and get some caffeine for the road. We then continued across the Trans-Canada and Coquihalla highways to our next stop at another Petro-Canada charging station in Kamloops, BC, about 286 kilometers away. When we arrived at the charger, we had 15% charge remaining. We stopped at the same Petro-Canada charger we visited on our way west, plugged in, and went for lunch at the nearby A&W restaurant. When we finished our lunch, I checked the charging status on the car, and we weren't getting anywhere near the amount of electricity I expected. The 150 kilowatt charging station was only delivering about 40 kilowatts. As I was standing at the station, a lady approached me and asked about our experience with the electric car. I've since learned this happens quite frequently, one of the perils of being an early adopter, I guess. I shared how happy we were with the car, along with some of the struggles we've had with the charging stations. She was really shocked that we could get 450 kilometers of range out of a charge. She had assumed most electric cars could only get around 100 to 150 kilometers. Maybe a few years ago, but not anymore. Talking with people about our experiences with the car has been one of my favorite things about it since we got it, and one of the most common misconceptions is that road trips are basically impossible. After my friendly conversation with the lady, I took a minute to wash the bugs off the windshield, unplugged the car, and moved it to the neighboring station. Unfortunately, it was even worse, only delivering about 35 kilowatts. Something was definitely up with those Petro-Canada chargers on that day, and I didn't want to wait hours for the car to charge up, especially since it's a per-minute payment rate. I checked PlugShare and saw that there were some Electrify Canada charging stations at a nearby Canadian Tire, so, even though their per-minute charge rate is much more expensive, we decided to drive over there and try our luck. When we arrived at the Electrify Canada charger, there was a technician doing some work on the station. The unit he was working on was non-functional, but thankfully the others were okay. I plugged in and we were immediately getting 115 kilowatts out of the charger. With this bit of good news, we wandered around and checked out some of the shops in the area. I also had a good chat with a fellow who had an electric Hyundai Kona, who was still also learning what his car was capable of. In fact, he was trying to figure out how to plug it into the charger and start a charging session. Our next planned charging stop was Revelstoke, BC, 212 kilometers away. Once we had enough charge to comfortably get there, about 65%, we were on our way. We knew Revelstoke was a nice place due to our unplanned stop on the way to the coast. It also had a few charging options, some 350 and 150 kilowatt Electrify Canada stations near the Railway Museum, and a 50 kilowatt charger run by BC Hydro but connected to the Flow network near the Visitor Centre. Before getting to Revelstoke, though, we had one stop to make. There's an unwritten rule that must be followed if you're from Alberta and traveling through BC in the summertime. You need to stop and pick up some BC fruit. When we were driving west, we had noticed a large fruit market called Fruit World in Sicamous, BC, and made the decision to stop there on the way home. Fruit World was a busy place and it took some time, but we managed to fill almost all the available space in the car with fresh fruit, and then we were finally on our way to Revelstoke. We pulled into the Electrify Canada charging station and plugged in, and were immediately notified that this charging session was on them. Electrify Canada was not going to bill us for the charge. I don't know why, but I also had no interest in looking a gift horse in the mouth. The charger was also working extremely well, staying consistently above 100 kilowatts. We originally only planned to charge up enough here to get us to Golden, about 150 kilometers away, but a free charge, especially a free fast charge, was simply too good to pass up. We decided to stay a little longer in Revelstoke. With the rate of charge we were getting, we knew the car wasn't going to take terribly long to charge though, so opted to wait with it until it reached 82% charge, and then went to have dinner at a local Italian restaurant afterwards. In retrospect, this choice, coupled with the earlier fruit market stop, turned out to be poor decisions, but we didn't know that yet. Dinner at the restaurant was good, but the service was slow, so it was quite late when we left Revelstoke a little after 7 p.m. We made our way toward Golden, which was our next scheduled stop. When we arrived at Golden, I stopped at the same Petro-Canada station we'd visited on our way west and experienced a similar challenge to what we had in Kamloops. There were 2 chargers and neither charger would go above 40 kilowatts. What was worse was both chargers kept airing out and giving charge faults. Since we'd charged up to 80% in Revelstoke, we had about 40% charge left, just enough to get us to Canmore. But it would be tight. I didn't really want to risk it. You definitely don't want to run out of charge in an electric car. It involves a flatbed tow truck and lots of time. It's not like you can just get a stack of AA batteries or a jerry can of electricity delivered to you and be on your way. Turns out we weren't going to get the chance to take the risk anyhow. The Trans-Canada Highway east of Golden was closing for overnight construction just as we arrived at the intersection. This meant we were going to have to detour through Radium, which adds another 100 kilometers to the distance between Golden and Canmore, and we didn't have the range to make it. This left us with a few options. 1, we could try charging more in Golden to get us the range needed to make it to Canmore through Radium. 2, we could stay the night in Golden, but it'd mean we'd have to leave early in the morning when the Trans-Canada first opened. My wife had to work the next day. 3, we could charge at the 50 kilowatt charger in Radium to give us the range needed to reach Canmore. The risk there being that Radium only has a single charger. If it was broken or closed, we would be stuck until it was available. We opted for option 1 and drove back to the Petro-Canada station to try charging again. One charger was blocked by a gas-powered car, the other was open. I plugged in at the available charger and was immediately getting charge faults. I could not get the station to connect to the car. The lady blocking the other station finally came out and moved her car, and I tried that station, but it was no better. I checked PlugShare and saw that there were also some Electrify Canada charger stations in Golden. We'd had good luck with them on this return trip, so figured I'd try it again. Finding the chargers was a little tricky. They're not really close to anything, but once I found them, I plugged in and started charging. The good news was that we were getting free charging again. The bad news was I couldn't get more than 43 kilowatts out of the charger. I was too worn out to do much troubleshooting, so just decided to suffer through the slow charging. Golden to Canmore through Radium would take about 60% of a charge at a bare minimum. I decided to charge to about 75% to be safe. At about 55% charge, the charger stopped. I unplugged it and started it again, and this time Electrify Canada decided it was going to charge me. Maybe they figured out that their only competition in town had chargers that weren't working. It still wasn't charging any faster. In hindsight, I should have tried some of the other chargers or at least some other handles, but I guess I just wasn't thinking that clearly at the time. Once we finally received 75% charge, we left and started making the trip to Canmore the long way around. This is the place where all the new safety features in modern cars really started to shine for me. I'm not a big fan of night driving in the mountains. There's often a lot of wildlife on the road and they have a tendency to jump in front of you when you least expect it. Thanks to things like automatic high beams, cruise control, and lane centering, the car was able to manage a lot of the day-to-day aspects of keeping the car on the road, while I was able to keep a more watchful eye on the roadsides for anything that might jump in front of us and turn the whole trip into a nightmare. Once we reached Banff, I was even able to turn on Blue Cruise and allow the car to do the driving hands-free. This made it even easier to keep a watchful eye on the areas where animals like to jump out. The driver assistance features in the car even monitor your eyes to make sure you're paying attention. If you were to doze off, the car will even attempt to wake you up by binging at you, tapping the brakes, and if needed, it'll also slow the car down to a speed that would minimize the risk that any occupants would be injured in a crash. It will not stop, though, and obviously a car moving at very slow speeds on a highway is at high risk of being rear-ended. Finally, after a trip through what felt like eternal darkness, we arrived in Canmore at around 2:20 a.m. This was when we received our next unpleasant surprise. Our plan was to stop at the Petro-Canada fast charger in Canmore and get just enough electricity to get us the rest of the way home. Unfortunately, for some unknown reason, Petro-Canada decided to close their chargers overnight. I have no idea whose bright idea it was, but when we pulled up to the chargers, they were taped off. I'm not sure if this is normal or was driven out of challenges Petro-Canada was having with their charging network at the time, but it left us with only one other option. Near downtown Canmore, there's a 50 kilowatt charger on the Flow network. We drove to it, plugged in at 2:35 a.m., and all of us napped while we waited for the car to receive enough of a charge to get us the rest of the way home. Since we made this trip, Electrify Canada has opened some new chargers in Canmore. I haven't been to them yet, but hopefully those ones are available 24/7. Finally, after our last charge of the trip, we left Canmore at about 3:10 in the morning and drove the rest of the way home, arriving at about 20 after 4 Mountain Daylight Time. It was a long and stressful trip home, and there were a few important lessons along the way. First, it's important to remember that these public charging networks are in their infancy, especially the non-Tesla ones. This means that there are going to be technical challenges. Don't assume a charger is going to work today just because it worked a few days prior. Second, always have multiple charging options available if you can. This definitely saved us on this trip. We ended up falling back to our backup charging options a few times. I don't know if the single charger in Radium was working because we didn't need to stop there. It was probably fine, but I deliberately made the decision to charge more in Golden so we could skip it. Even with the charging challenges at Petro-Canada and Electrify Canada, some charge is better than no charge. Having only a single option creates a single point of failure. Also, at least so far in my experience, 50 kilowatt chargers at this point seem to be more reliable than the 150 and 350 kilowatt chargers. I have yet to come across one that hasn't been working. They seem to be an excellent backup option if you can spare the extra time it takes to charge, even if it's just to give you enough electricity to get you to the next high-speed charger. Third, and most importantly, always know as much about what's happening on your route as you can. This was our big mistake on this trip. I grew up in BC. I know the BC government does a good job of posting highway reports. It's necessary in an area of the country where roads can be closed by storms, washed out by floods, buried in avalanches of snow, or wiped out by rock slides at a moment's notice. Because we were traveling in summer and the weather had been perfect, I didn't even think about checking the road reports before we left the Lower Mainland. If I had, then I would have seen that the highway was going to be closed after Golden that night. Had we known what time the road was going to close, we would have pushed a little harder earlier in the trip. A little less time at the fruit stand, charging and eating at the same time in Revelstoke. There was a number of places we could have made up the time we needed, since we literally missed the ability to get through by minutes. Had we known we had a hard cutoff time, we would have considered it in our decisions around stops, and it would have saved hours of driving and charging time off our trip. Yes, it might have made earlier parts of the trip, especially heavy traffic and construction zones, a little more stressful, but the pace we were traveling was very leisurely. Had we known we were under the gun, we could have gotten to Golden much more quickly. We just didn't know we had a deadline. In the end, though, we made it home safe and sound. This trip was a good example of how traveling long distances in an electric car right now requires more thought than a gas-powered car, but the reality is it's only going to get better with time. I bet driving from Calgary to Vancouver and back 100 years ago in a Model T was much more challenging than what we went through, even if you could fill up the Model T's tank a little more quickly. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Until next time, I'm Ken Pierce, and thank you for watching Electrically Canadian.